Welcome to today's webcast, everyone. As you know, because you signed up, we're going to be discussing workplace harassment. And joining me today are Susan Brecher and Katrina Nobles from the Scheinman Institute at Cornell University. So tell me a little bit about your work, just to kind of kick things off. Tell us what you do at Scheinman, what the overall goal of the organization is as it relates to Cornell University, and of course, how it ties into our subject today of workplace harassment. Susan, want to kick it off?
Sure.
Right.
Katrina and I work for the Scheinman Institute, which is the Institute for Conflict Resolution, and even broader. So I am the director of our professional development programs in employee relations, employment law, and diversity and inclusion, which are directly related to the topic we're talking about today.
Perfect. And Katrina, tell me about what you do.
I'm the Director of Conflict Programs for the Scheinman Institute, so I do a broad range of things on and off campus, working with organizations and individuals on conflict. And for the topic today, harassment as a topic area can often bring up conflict.
So I should ask, both of you work not only at the university, right, as in a faculty capacity, but you also work with companies as well, doing consultation work. Let's get into that really quickly, because I think a lot of people in our audience would be curious how that applies to the real world and, of course, to their jobs.
So we do a public workshop series, and anyone can come to that. And what happens is a lot of organizations then want to take what we do, because it's real practical application, and bring it into their organizations. So we bring in programs on employee relations, conducting investigations, and the employment laws that are relevant, as well as programs in cross-cultural communications and conflict.
Right.
And along with our colleagues in the Scheinman Institute, we will often consult with organizations too. So after coming in for a training or something like that, and working with the organization in that capacity, we also help with the application of those trains and potentially building some structure around that in the organization.
Perfect. Okay, so this is a good point to back up a little bit and talk about what we're talking about. Harassment in the workplace. What does that involve? I mean, we have a human resources audience out here. We have a women in leadership audience, entrepreneurship, and several other channels. People have been invited and are involved. So we have people with varying degrees of sophistication and familiarity with harassment. What are we talking about when we talk about harassment?
Okay, so what's interesting about this is, let's start with what the law says, yet you need to know that the federal law does not have this definition. It's part of the interpretations. And it basically, when you talk about sexual harassment, it's unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and anything with physical conduct. And what has happened is people lose sight of the other definition, which is about all types of harassment in the protected classes: race, gender, national origin, age. And in that context, they're really focusing on those verbal or physical areas of conduct, and they denigrate, show hostility. So that's the working definition. And really what it focuses on are two areas. And one is what I like to call the power-based. And that's what we're seeing in the news today: abuse of power for making decisions or preventing people from feeling like they can do things. And then we also have the environmental. So many people like to call it hostile work environment, yet really what it is environmental. It goes into any environmental impacts. And with that, I've given you the federal law, but what a lot of people don't know is that it goes much broader, because there are state and local laws that provide even greater rights.
By design, that's the way this whole thing is set up.
Exactly, exactly. So let me just give you a historical evolution of a very relevant area. What has happened is, originally the federal law did not recognize sexual orientation or gender identity.
Until?
Well, it isn't even formally recognized. However, the interpretations by the EEOC, the agency, have begun to recognize it. Yet state and local laws have been recognizing a protected class for gender identity, expression, and sexual orientation, and this has been going on for years and years. So you have to keep in mind that you have both of these areas when we start talking about it, when we're saying legal as the basis for it.
You had described, and I don't want to get too far off the path, but this concept of aversion, right? In addition to hostility, how does diversion play out? Like in a work situation, you're talking about, I'm not going to work with that person. Is that what we're saying here?
Yeah, and I think if you put this into context, these are all terms that have been broadly and loosely used. And so what happens is these go to jury trials if you want to talk about the law, and it's a jury who sits down and interprets what those words mean based on the behaviors that are presented to them. And it isn't very clear. One of the terms that you hear used is it severe and pervasive?
Okay.
And that, I think, is one of the ways that people begin to say, okay, does it exist? Yet I also have some trouble with that because you do remember the severe part. They lose sight of that. They think it means one time isn't enough, and if it's severe enough and it's that kind of physical, then we're talking about right there and then it's going to be a clear violation, especially if it's power-based.
So if we've got the legal component, federal and state and so on, where do the policies fit in? How do you craft policy either around the legalities, and of course, how do those policies relate to overall mission statement? And we're getting into a lot of stuff, but I wanted your take on that, Katrina.
So I think that policies kind of pull us into what we have as legal as kind of our base, our foundation, and policies pull us into something broader. And Susan really has a lot more experience with the policy piece of it, how legal goes to policy. So I'm going to turn to her for that, and then talk a little bit more about some of the other items you mentioned.
Got it. Okay.
So the reason why this is that I have a legal background, yet I think of myself more as an employee relations HR specialist.
Yep.
And what's great about policies is that they all contain, at the minimum, the legal standard. But all policies today go way beyond that. And what they're looking for is a higher expectation of respect and dignity in the workplace. What everyone doesn't think about, and where the big change is this is all associated with the organization's mission statement and their value statements. And it's the implication of that moves us in a totally different direction. And that's really where I can turn to Katrina to share some insights into what we're talking about with values.
So when we get into kind of the mission statement and values of organizations, I think it's an interesting thing because, policies get to that on some level, but it's really like these broader concepts. It's things like respect and dignity and ideals around diversity and inclusion. We think about kind of these broader things, and I think that one of the difficulties that organizations particularly have is that the mission and values is the ideal. Right? That's our ideal end goal. We want to be this amazing thing. We want to have these amazing values and to carry those forward in support of our workforce. We don't often have the conversation about what are the actions and behaviors that would actually support that.
They're often abstractions, right?
Right. So, and I think
they come from the top, unfortunately, sometimes, right? Yep.
Right, and I think that's part of the difficulty with the law as well. Susan mentioned earlier, we have these things, these terms, right? Like a severe and pervasive. What does that mean? How do you define that? Yeah, it is pretty squishy. So organizations kind of fall into that same boat, even when we're talking about missions and values, not just laws, that it's hard to define, and everybody has a different lens they're looking through to define that. So until you have the conversation, there's not a good definition, and you're going to have everybody looking through different lenses.
So one of the things we do in training is we encourage the leaders, the HR professionals, the managers to really find out what the terms mean to the people they work with. And so sometimes we'll say, well, go out there and what does harassment mean? What is harassment? And you're going to get multiple responses from employees.
You get a survey feedback type situation going on where
I
you're
ask
getting
them
this
to
data?
informally do this.
Okay,
and the
all right.
point is for them to get the insight. Our focus
personally.
when we do training is to really help organizations better understand what's happening. And one of the ways is we're all making assumptions, and it's all about assumptions. And we think we know what people think our values are. We all have the same words, yet we may not have the same understanding. Or, as Katrina just said, a way of describing the behaviors associated with it. So
Right, yeah, I think that, so there's a couple of examples that I think that Susan and I can probably provide. I recently was working with an organization that was having some pretty severe conflict on multiple levels. And they were trying to figure out what is the root of this conflict.
How did it manifest itself, or what was the conflict looking like? All kinds of things?
Yeah, so it was people within the workplace feeling as though it was a hostile work environment. That was a term that came up often. People feeling harassed by their manager. That was another term that came up, and they were trying to figure out, okay, so what are you seeing that makes you think that it's harassment, or what are you seeing that makes you think it's a hostile work environment? And so one of the things that I did with the group was I came in and did an assessment. So in terms of assessing kind of what levels are conflict happening on, but also figuring out, how are some of the employees and management defining some of these terms?
What's interesting about that is, just as a point that we always talk about, is those words, hostile work environment and harassment, are really used as the legal terms. Yet those legal terms focus on what we call the protected classes, including gender, sexual, and in this case, when people are using it, they're really talking more about conflict and not getting along.
They're talking about the overall workplace climate, right? The culture of the workplace.
Can I ask what industry this was in?
So this one was in higher education, actually.
Really?
Yep.
Okay. I was expecting a really tough restaurant or something.
No, well, that's the reality. It's everywhere.
It sure is. Yep.
Yep, and it's not an uncommon thing to see. This happens to be the most recent example in my mind, but this particular example actually applies to other organizations we've worked with. But the interesting thing about this is when we sat down and we said, okay, so let's talk a little bit about the values of this group. And so we came up with what they thought all the main values were. And I said, okay, so let's take it a level deeper. Let's have a conversation about a shared understanding about each of these values. What action would you put on that value, or what behavior would you put on that value? All the answers that came back were different, and it created this discussion of, oh, you think that's what respect looks like? Or you think that's disrespectful? No, not at all. So taking these big umbrella terms like respect and dignity and actually saying, okay, what action actually goes along with it? If you show up to a meeting late, is that disrespectful? And why is it disrespectful? And when might it be okay, and when might it not be okay? So actually talking about very kind of micro actions and behaviors to come up with what it looks like is incredibly important, because everybody's lens is a little different. To talk a little bit more about a really specific example within the workplace, within kind of a coaching relationship, I think Susan has kind of a better recent example of that.
So I do get brought into organizations to spend time with individuals who have been accused of inappropriate behaviors in the workplace. And let me just start by saying, I think that's what we're trying to get organizations to do. It's very easy when you work with employees to help them understand they know what they consider inappropriate, and in most instances when you describe behaviors, they'll understand that. And that is the basis on where the organization can begin to problem solve. Yet before you get there, because I know this is important to you, Chris, is what goes on is if somebody actually raises a complaint, then the organization is going to do two things. And I like to say this first. Their obligation is to get the conduct to stop. So if you're going to investigate and the conduct is still going on while you're investigating, you're really not addressing behaviors to get it to stop. If it's not an egregious thing and you can look into it, then you want to conduct what we call a fair and neutral investigation. And that takes a lot of skills to learn how to do that type of a thing.
How do you set the terms for that? What's involved in that?
Okay, well, that's my luck. Right?
Okay, right. Thought you might have an answer.
I think what people are looking for is, and I hear the word consistent all the time, a methodology, and we try to explain to them, you really can't be totally consistent. What you want to be able to do is have a methodology that you've developed and think about that methodology, and in each situation be able to say, why did I do this one way versus another way? Because I think when we get challenged, if it becomes litigation, the challenge is really around, well, why didn't you talk to this person? And if you're prepared to indicate, well, I didn't talk to this person because actually when I spoke with the individual who did it, the individual said, well, yeah, I did it. It just isn't what I meant it to be. So you may not have to talk to more people when a person says, yes, I did it.
Right.
And the other piece, though, that is the outcome from that is that it's not enough to just look at the outcome of an investigation based on what are we going to do now to this individual. It's going one step further and wanting to be preventive. And in some organizations, what will be an outcome is, even if they don't find a violation of the law, they may still feel that the behaviors that an individual engaged in were not respectful and therefore a violation of the policy or a preventive action. That's where I'll go in and do coaching. And when I do the coaching, I'm helping that individual see that their behaviors were inappropriate, and then helping them sort of peel the onion to look at the behaviors they have, which means building a level of trust. So what Katrina was asking me to tell you about is the kind of situation where I've been brought in and somebody has really said something that was seen by an individual as inappropriate. And the way the manager said it, and it was a joke, and they didn't intend it, ultimately, really when you look at it, isn't the kind of comment you have to make. And as I explored that, I was trying to get other behaviors, and the manager gave me an example of a situation where he went in and told one of his supervisors that what she had to do was just get it done. Senior management wanted it done. And she was pushing back, and he said, "You're being oversensitive." And she stood up and she said, "You know what? That's a gender statement. You would not have said that to me if I was a man." And so I had the relationship with him, and I said, "Well, what might you say to a man?" And he said to me, I would have just said to them, and I won't use his language, he was very open, and he just basically said, "Tough, get it done." And when he reflected on that, he said, wow, I am treating women and men differently. And that becomes a very big concern. And I know this goes into some of the areas that we can talk about in bias, unconscious bias,
we could go on all day long, right? And gender bias just doesn't come from men, right? It's kind of on all sides and it's deeply ingrained. One thing I was going to ask about is we have, from what I understand, 4 generations roughly working in a workforce. And we have varying degrees of ways of just getting it done, right? So maybe an old school, hard-nosed kind of behaviors all the way down to the millennial generation, for instance, right? And the use of terms like microaggression and how this might fit into the human resource practitioners' set of tools that they have to help resolve issues at work. I mean, what do you see generationally going on, or as it relates to expectations that people have of what the workplace is supposed to be like?
That's a tough question.
It was about 5 questions in one, but
I kind of react to the generational statement, so I have to start by saying to you, we all have different working styles.
That's right.
And those styles don't necessarily break down by generation either. And while I know there are generalizations or stereotypes that are given, and it gives us insights into individuals, that's where we begin to have problems. So this is me talking about where misunderstandings occur. And so one of our goals is to really help people understand their reaction to behaviors.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think one of the things that we really focus in on is individual reflection, and looking through the lens of each person as an individual. So I'm not looking at you as Chris the man and grouping you in as part of all men, as a for instance, but instead I'm trying to get to know you as Chris. What's your working style? What's your conflict style? How might we work best together?
Right.
And I think that's a real difficulty sometimes when we get into the generational conversations, right? Because we focus too much on the generation.
I think so. And I didn't mean to mislead that, because I think there are certain attributes that you can point to, and there's certain commonalities that certainly exist. So I didn't want to say, one generation's tougher than another necessarily, but that's what people walk around with.
It is.
Yeah.
It's a difficult thing because I think it speaks to culture a little bit, right?
Yep.
So it's the lens that we have for culture and our own individual culture. We think of culture as kind of this group thing. Like Americans are X, Y, and Z,
Yep.
while Europeans are A, B, and C, right? So we think about these large groupings. It's kind of the same with the generations. But when we're thinking about our individual culture, we're thinking about, where does that come from? Part of it's based on our social identities. Part of it's based on our upbringing. If we're American or U.S. based, what part of the country did we grow up in? Was it urban? Was it rural? All of these things make a huge difference on the culture that we individually have going forward. And that's the lens that we bring to the workplace. And so getting people to reflect on that individually and understand that even if I've been part of, for me, I've been part of Cornell for almost 10 years. So yes, I may have a culture, or I may have a lens that I look through from the culture of Cornell, but I also bring with me a ton of other culture, right, that comes from my past experience and also the experience that goes on every day for me when I'm not sitting at work. So it's really focusing in on individuals, I think, is a huge piece of what we do in reflection.
We have recently come up with looking at all of this by using the terminology lens, because I think that people say, what is bias? What is unconscious bias? And and we like to use micro inequities versus aggressions as another way to think about it, okay? And people distinguish those, but for purposes of beginning to explore it, but it's all about what's our lens. How are we seeing this? And we each see things based on all of the things that Katrina said. And I think there's a greater aha moment when individuals can see, you're not attacking me, you're recognizing that I come in with a different lens. And each one is different. Then we need to think about whether or not some of those lenses are impacting my behaviors in a way that I should or should not be acting. And I think that's going back to the behaviors point.
Or it's even having the recognition of those impacts, right? Because it's difficult, right? What I think of being okay may not be okay for somebody else.
On the other hand, we hear people say all the time, recognize your biases. You need to know where to go after that. And one of the pieces that we've been trying to work with, and I do it even with people conducting investigations in harassment situations, and one of the things is helping them understand, now where do I go? And some of that is beginning to think about, how can I look at this from another perspective? And one of our words is, maybe that person was thinking this, and maybe, so that we're not jumping to conclusions or reaching some sort of assumptions that we think exist.
Speaking of perspectives, I neglected to tell the audience that they can enter questions in the chat anytime. So we have our team behind the scenes to help get those questions to me. I have an iPad sitting right in front of me. So if you have any questions at all for our panel here, Susan and Katrina, please enter them in. I'll be looking the whole time, and we can hit some of at the end as well. Another thing I neglected to mention, I'm glad I'm bringing this up now, which is you can earn 0.1 continuing education unit credits through Cornell University by taking a quiz at the end. So we developed a four question quiz, not too rigorous, but you will have had to pay attention to the conversation here in order to pass. So if you want to get 0.1 CEUs from the ILR school in Cornell University, stick around afterward, after class, and we'll run a quiz. And again, per the instructions in the Connect window, you'll need to return to Adobe Connect in order to take the quiz at the end. Okay, so let's move on. That was a great little diversion, by the way. I really enjoyed that. I hope it didn't get us too off track. But I do want to ask, so what are organizations doing about harassment? What should they be doing broadly?
Okay, so remember earlier I mentioned to you state and local laws?
Yep.
And while federal law has always encouraged training about harassment and sexual harassment, what's happened now is that there are state and local laws that are requiring training. And it's varying in multiple levels in terms of who's requiring it, how they're requiring it, the depth of the requirement, and some of that fits into the expectations on ensuring that behaviors are being addressed. So, for example, when we get into training, a lot of organizations have given people the definitions, asked them to state the definitions or recognize the definitions, and they use some sort of a quizzing like we're talking about here. Yet these organizations are asking to use a little bit more interactivity. Get them involved in understanding situations and make sure that questions can be answered for them.
Are we talking about interactive simulation type things? What are we talking about?
Yeah, I think it's in line of a simulation, also taking situations and seeing if they understand what they fit in, and more important, allowing them to ask questions. And that means you have to have someone available either to answer the questions or come back and respond to the questions. So that's one element to it. And in that training, what Katrina and I have talked about is that's only step one. And most organizations are really only ready for step one, which is why we have a Me Too movement. And we have to say one more thing that we have not really all focused on here, that's the reality. And the real reality in these situations is most organizations today are less concerned about the liability and more concerned about the exposure in the media, in social media, because this is where people are empowered to speak up.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so
your company could be under fire, like I always say, by the next day, sundown. You know, you suddenly have a social media crisis.
Yeah.
It could manifest itself in a million ways. So I think you're absolutely right. So less liability, more like exposure.
Yeah,
right?
I kind of build a picture when I'm doing training for managers. And one of the things that we say is, originally we used to say to people, would you like to see yourself on a court wall engaging in these behaviors? You want to understand what's inappropriate? Think about that. Now, then we moved up to, would you like to see yourself on the 6 o'clock news engaging in these behaviors? Now, would you like to see yourself spoken about or exposed on YouTube or in social media? And all of a sudden, the aha moment comes.
And we're talking about behaviors that this individual may or may not think is necessarily bad. Is that how you're approaching this? I hope I'm getting the point.
Well, I think that sometimes people challenge what they think is appropriate and inappropriate. I don't think that it's really that difficult to understand that behaviors that are inappropriate. There's not that fine line. If I'm saying negative things about people, if I'm telling jokes, if I'm making innuendos, certainly if I'm making somebody feel that because of who they are and the sense of I need to do what this person expects me to do, and sexually is primary, as we're seeing in the news now, and if I don't do it, I lose lots of opportunities. And not just the opportunities to advance or to get raises, but to even ask for recommendations, even to grow, and that's what you're seeing as some of the hot topics in this area. I think what Katrina and I are most concerned about is that organizations now, the laws and organizations are looking for ways to help employees and prepare managers. And so I'll talk about the managers and we'll talk about the empowering of managers. And so managers need to learn to know what to say. Because we tell managers you have to report this, and now some laws say all employees have to report it. Yet I think what managers don't know is, what do I do if somebody says something to me or I see it? And some of them think if I see it I don't have to do anything. We now teach you do have to do something. You always did have to do something. But we want them to feel comfortable speaking. So here's a practical tool that we think managers should learn to memorize, which is, thank you for coming to me. And I have to tell you, this involves our policies, and I'm going to refer you to HR, and I really appreciate that at least you feel comfortable talking to me. What that basically says is building that trust, because the employee has to understand, yes, you'll let HR know they're coming, that the employee may not go. But if an employee says, I want this totally confidential, the manager has to be able to say, I know this will be handled with discretion. We can't keep it confidential. They need those tools. So do employees who are being asked to report things, to be able to say if someone is upset, or at least to know how to go and report and what to say when they do it. So that's the reporting element and giving those tools to people who need to do it. I think the big thing is we constantly get people who say, well, why didn't you just tell me not to do it? Why didn't you just tell me you didn't like it?
And I think that brings up the power of speaking up, right? We need to be able to empower our employees to do one of a couple of things. One would be to speak up themselves. If they're put into an uncomfortable situation, if they're feeling uncomfortable about their coworkers or their supervisors' actions or sentiments that are being shared with them, right? And if they're not comfortable doing that, having the appropriate channels and access points to go to that somebody else may be able to speak up for them. So if that's a supervisor, if that's an HR manager, if that's employee relations, etc.
Right, and that's just a workplace cultural kind of value thing, right? We're all here together, right? You can count on your coworker to bounce things off. I have a question from Kathleen here, and this bit goes back to something previously that we kind of touched on. Kathleen asks, do you have any suggestions for team exercises to help people look at colleagues as individuals instead of making gender or generational assumptions? We sort of touched on that, but we haven't really talked about team exercises or what managers can do. It sort of relates to what we were talking about. Any thoughts on this?
We have a couple of things that we use, and some of them are on the internet. We alluded to working styles. And very often, if you do use working styles, what the aha moment again is for everybody in the room is, look at this, it doesn't break down by gender, it doesn't break down by race, it doesn't break down by generation. These are the ways we work. So some examples of that: some of us are more analytical in the way we approach things, some of us are more expressive, some of us may be more directional and wanting things to just happen, and we have people who are more amiable and they just want to make everybody happy. When you have those insights, you can then, one, realize that we all have this, we're common, and also you can also recognize, how do I flex to get the best out of each other? So that's one example I can give you that might help with that.
I was going to say it's interesting that Susan brought this up, because in particular, when the two of us first started working together, we kind of went through that exercise because we have different working styles. And it was noticeable, and because we work in the area we work in, we had kind of that access point to say, hey, maybe we should talk about our working styles. So I think that's a really good one. I think the other one is actually working with kind of a Thomas Kilmann conflict style inventory.
Explain.
And so there's 5 different conflict styles or major conflict styles that are typically seen within individuals. So it is an individual inventory, and those styles are collaborative, compromising, accommodating, avoiding, and competing. And this is another thing. The Thomas Kilmann inventory is a very popular inventory that's used. It's not something specific to our group. But so this is another way to kind of explore, how do we engage in conflict differently? So what's my dominant conflict strategy? Do I typically try to avoid conflict? Do I typically go into a competing mode where it's more of kind of a fight mode? Do I typically just accommodate? And some of these things, interestingly enough, we've done an overlay of the conflict styles with the working styles because they definitely relate.
There's the correlations.
Yes.
Do you have a question, or can I build on what Katrina just said?
Go ahead, please build. We'll get to Sarah's question in just a moment.
What I want to build on is that when we get into harassment, we're looking for a common language. So what we're trying to recognize is it's very difficult for people to say something to someone else. And when we use the word common language, we have a method that we have also shared that we call respectful feedback. And we teach people how to listen when somebody else just wants to tell you very nicely, you know, what you did before Chris made me feel uncomfortable when we were in the meeting. And so I really am uncomfortable when you make comments, and I'd really like that you don't say that anymore. And I really appreciate that you're spending the time talking to me about this, because I like working with you. It's a one-way conversation. Now, if I came to say that to you, you would want to come back and respond.
Right.
If we have a common language and I say, I'm coming to you with respectful feedback, if you understand that amongst the organization, you're going to step back and say, oh, Susan she likes me, she values me, she doesn't want to get me in trouble, so let me listen to what she has to say.
Let me help you do your job better. or something along those lines.
Or
Go
let
ahead.
us work better together.
Or let us work better together. Yes.
There's one other thing I just wanted to mention with the inventories, which is really important. We always say in our training, so I didn't want to leave it out for this, and that is these are not personality styles. So if you do choose to kind of do these style inventories, these are styles that we use, and we may have a dominant style, but they're styles that we can flex. So we can use other styles within that same inventory. So that's an important distinction between if I were to take like the MBTI personality test versus one of these style inventories.
Yeah, exactly. And conflict is something that most people tend to, let's be honest, be averse to, right? Even the word almost brings anxiety among people, but it's really a necessary part of work. And that's just the way we do it, right? That's how you get through things. Sarah asks us, she joins us from New York. I had an experience with a he said, she said situation, and HR did not discipline the aggressor. How do you handle situations without witnesses? And maybe that's perhaps one of the reasons that HR decided not to. What about a no witness situation? How do you handle that when somebody feels lost and alone?
So I would like to start with one thing, which is the catch-22 from the HR viewpoint, and what a lot of individuals may not understand is that while you may not be aware, there may be ways that things are addressed. And that's the problem. When we conduct an investigation, we will take appropriate action, yet it may not be something that we can go back and specifically tell the person. And that doesn't mean, and I know the big concern of the hardest is the he said, she said. And that's probably the more difficult investigations. And at times we need to make some sort of a determination. And that determination would be based on our understanding of talking to the individuals and other people to help us with a sense of what people like to call credibility. But what I do want to say, Sarah, that's most important, and the question I would be asking you, more is about if you don't think anything was done, does that mean the behaviors are still continuing? Because that gets us into retaliation. And if you have raised a complaint and an individual is now taking negative action against you because you complained or doesn't stop the behavior, then that's really important to bring forth and to really talk about. And it may not be, in this case, a he said, she said. There may be specific behaviors that you can point out that have changed.
That don't align with company values or just basic laws of decency and so on, but...
More than that, you're taking negative actions because I complained.
That's right.
Or you haven't stopped doing what you did.
Right.
Don't give up. Go back again. Raise it again. Because I think you've seen in the Me Too movement, nobody was surprised when all individuals were exposed. It isn't like people could say, I never heard about that with that person. Or this was the only time it happened. There are people who in the workplace abuse their power. Or are disrespectful in a way that violates the policy.
And this is something that comes up whether it's an offense that warrants termination or whether it gets elevated to a legal situation or not. Short of that, then you've got workplace behaviors to point to, right?
Yeah.
And just general hostility at the workplace, retaliatory behavior. Let me ask if we have any more questions from the audience. We're nearing a time block. I should just tell the audience, I'll be perfectly honest. There's going to be a fire alarm that's going to go off shortly. So we're trying to get in under the wire, but I want to encourage any of you to ask questions here while we have our Cornell faculty here. So let's see, what else do we want to take a look at as far as organizations? What should they be doing? Is there anything we missed as far as that goes, as far as empowering employees? I mean, how does a manager, that seems very difficult. That is, to empower employees to speak up. I think people are just generally inclined not to do that. How do you nurture that culture? How do you get that going?
I think part of it is shifting what we think of as traditional organizational culture, right? I mean, there's, especially in the U.S., although in a lot of globalized companies as well, there's kind of a traditional idea of a hierarchical structure.
Yes.
Right? And so in some ways that perpetuates kind of some of the issues that we see coming up with people not being willing to speak because there is a power differential right? Because there's that hierarchy. And so there is a fear around, well, what if I bring up that my supervisor did this, or that one of the leaders of the company did this, or that I was really uncomfortable with this person, even if they're on the same level as me, are they going to be the person that gets the promotion because I'm viewed as the problem child?
Right.
Or are they going to stop talking to me? One of the biggest things is coworkers stop talking to each other because someone has complained and they don't want to get involved.
Right. Right. And so I think part of it is that shifting of the culture. What are the ways that we can shift an organizational culture? What are the ways that we can have the conversation as an organization, come up with those shared expectations that we kind of, or shared understanding that we talked about earlier, but then move that forward. How do we continue to kind of support those shared understandings, right? So that's providing additional access points. That's providing bystander training, but also
And support. Encouraging people
Right.
to say, I saw that happen. I'll support you in discussing this. Or, I would like to help you in any way. What do you need?
But I think it's looking at it, those support points from a proactive kind of lens
Yes.
as opposed to a reactive lens, because I think too often we're reacting to the person that comes to us and says, this person has been doing this for the last 6 months and I'm completely uncomfortable with it, and here's all the reasons why, as opposed to supporting the culture in which that person may have said after the first time something happened, I'd really like to give you some respectful feedback. Exactly what Susan was talking about earlier, right?
Right.
Or, Supervisor Chris, I'm really having a problem with this. This happened the other day. What do I do? Right? So having those support points earlier on in the process makes it a completely different organizational culture.
Can we talk about a case study that you pointed out a little bit a while ago? There was a Metro Transit Authority person who was in a managerial/directorial position who posted photos of themselves in blackface. How did that play out within the organization? Because we talk about, we're talking about the history of this, and harassment isn't just about sexual harassment, but it's about all kinds of other things. So how did this particular case play out, and how does it relate to some of the things we've been discussing today?
Well, I think when you ask about the play out, it's very simple. That organizations are not going to tolerate any behaviors that are that egregious. There's your severe statement, and they don't want individuals to be exposed. And that's where social media really reflects poorly if a company doesn't take it seriously. And in that situation, it was addressed. And you're seeing more and more. The only thing I think that has to be balanced, and it's the most difficult thing, is that before certain actions are taken, you really need to find out more information. You have to go forward and ask some questions. When it's this egregious, it seems very obvious, yet there may be underlying things that have occurred, and this may be a part of the culture in that work group. It's an unacceptable culture, but if we only do something about that person, and we don't look at everybody and begin to address it, then we're really not accomplishing, and it will continue to go on.
Something made him feel like that was permissive, that it was okay.
I tend to find people just don't think. I honestly have to say they don't stop and think of the impact of what they're doing.
I know.
They basically just act, and
Yeah.
then afterwards get woken up. And I see this time and time again. No matter how much we say, that they won't remember, and they'll just do it. It's really it's that lack of forethought.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of to speak to what you were just mentioning in terms of it feeling kind of permissive.
Yeah.
I think that goes to those little support points that an organization can have in a more proactive manner, right? So even if something is just the tiniest thing, having a colleague that says, hey, Susan, that made me really uncomfortable, sets a tone, right, where that more egregious thing is not going to be viewed as something that's permissive, but also is something that the person may think about instead of not thinking about, right, because of these little kind of support interactions that they've had with colleagues.
Yeah, exactly. I have a couple good questions here. Cheryl chimes in. How would you address the critique that employees or people in general are responding too sensitively to some behaviors in the workplace? Does this come up?
All the time, okay? First of all, I would again go back on what does sensitive mean, and that all goes to describing the behaviors. And often, while the behaviors may not violate the policy, the question you're asking goes back to culture. Why are people feeling, and why is that message being brought? And I do think that sometimes there is that balance, because when look, sometimes employees bring situations that are not rising to anywhere near the violation of the EEO policy and harassment. Yet what they are trying to say is there's a lack of transparency, there's a lack of communication. So quite often what happens is that person really thinks that actions are being taken based on these kinds of behaviors, when in fact it's because they didn't understand why it happened. And so I have this happen all the time, where a situation where a manager says, an employee says to the manager, that person really, said a comment that made me feel very uncomfortable. And let's say it wasn't a sexual comment. And then the next time there's a meeting, that person says, the manager doesn't send that person to the meeting because the one who made the comment was going to be at the meeting. And he feels like the reason why I'm not being sent is because of the fact that I told the manager about the comment. But really, it wasn't that person's turn. And if the manager just went back and said, I just want you to know you're not going to the meeting because I want to give other people a chance to go to meetings, and this is something we talked about before, not a change in behavior. So I think the sensitivity comes from the lack of communication. And if you want to talk a little bit more about what employees feel, they aren't getting feedback. I'm not talking about respectful feedback now. They're not getting people telling them more about how they're doing, both positive and constructive. And this manifests itself very often in what I hear is the word sensitivities.
Do you want to say something?
I was just going to say, I think that also comes from our lived experience, right? So everybody has a different perception of what should be permissible and what should not. And it's based on our experience. It's based on our culture that we then bring into an organizational culture. And then so our cultures are coming up against everybody else's culture. And we may have some different views. So it goes back to having that conversation about the shared understanding around actions and behaviors, right? That's where we can't often match up our mission and our values with what happens day to day, because there is that gap between the conversation of, oh, we want to have this value, right? So, but I view that value as, you will do this, 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 and this, but you don't view it as doing any of those things, but we haven't had that conversation. So it goes back to that communication piece, but it's not just the individual communication, it's the organizational communication. It's how do we come up with that shared understanding?
HR has so much more of a strategic, significant role in companies than it used to, and I think all of this is kind of manifest of that. I'm kind of overwhelmed by the responsibility that some HR managers are expected to have, people in human resources, right? I mean,
it's not all transactional.
That
it
certainly
is
is not.
much higher.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is partnership. We were just having this discussion earlier this morning. It's partnering. It's partnering with all the experts in the organization in order to achieve this, and getting rid of the negative rap of HR and really building those relationships so that as a team, and managers understand their operations better. There are people in diversity and inclusion that have a different lens on looking at things, and it's partnering with HR so that strategically we can build a place where employees want to work and feel comfortable.
And I think that's of the utmost importance in an organization, especially in kind of the era we're in now, where it could feel outrageously overwhelming for an HR professional or an ER professional. It is those partnering opportunities that makes it doable, right? You have to go at it as a group from an organizational perspective. You can't just go in and say, oh, well, this is all up to me now.
That's right. So let's shift gears really quickly. I've got time for maybe one more question, or one or two. Savannah checks in. Are there universal tools? This is getting to the tactical now. Are there universal tools that can help managers to learn how to address or investigate instances of alleged harassment, particularly ones that would be applicable outside of the USA? So I presume that this is when you're looking at a candidate, right? And you've caught the wind that they're...
I thought I meant, when I heard the word investigation, I heard it more around these types of areas of harassment where we have to conduct an investigation. That's how I was reading the question.
Can you help managers to learn how to address or investigate instances of alleged harassment? Okay, well, maybe it is a little more broad than what we're thinking about.
Well, it's that kind of an investigation that we were talking about before. And one thing I would sort of say is I hope that managers may not be the ones who conduct these kinds of investigations unless they know how to do it. Yet sometimes this can be guided by people who have that expertise. And the question I want to go to is, I really believe in Google for tools, or search engines for tools.
Yeah.
The only thing that people have to understand is you can't totally rely on it. If somebody can say, I found these tools, are they within what we want to be done at our organization? Here are some things we can be using. So if someone were to do that, you're going to find a lot of these things online. They will be there to help people with those ways to manage harassment and ways to Google. And let me just say, as an example, New York State has really come out very strong right now on requiring training and requiring educating people and providing them. If you Google New York State's training, it is very explicit with real examples and ways you can educate people. It doesn't teach investigations. I really want to say that's very complex.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say that really the best tool for that is to send somebody from your organization to a full-on training in investigations, because it is complex.
Yeah, they don't teach it. They don't teach it in any programs of undergraduate or that, or to get together as a group in an organization and say, what's the method we want to use? I stay away from managers doing investigations. I really do. That's not their role. We kind of say with managers, you had an expertise because you were great at what your job is. But it doesn't mean you know how to manage or how to handle employee relations issues.
Yes.
So go get advice. That's the thing we say over and over and over again.
When in doubt, don't.
Don't, and get advice.
That's very good. Okay, well, we've just got a couple moments together, and I do want to discuss some of the online programs that you put together related to these very things. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention them. Susan, your courses are still in progress.
Yes.
Tell me about what's to come.
Well, what's to come is we have taken the employment laws and we put together a series of courses. And what's exciting about this is one of my colleagues at Scheinman Institute, Alex Colvin, has put together the international portion, and I've put in the U.S. portion. And we have one course that really looks at it in this broad sense of the laws and policies and getting advice and what's the role. So we've got a series of courses now on the laws that'll be coming out.
Perfect. So I should just mention that those are forthcoming. We don't have any URLs to share, but if you want to engage, just check on eCornell and simply drop us a line and ask us a question about Susan's upcoming legal programs. You have conflict resolution course that you did with Sally. Tell us a little bit about that.
So Sally Klingel and I, another one of our Scheinman Institute colleagues, did a certificate on conflict resolution. So it is 3 courses plus an elective, and it focuses in on diagnosing conflict first, and we have a full diagnostic approach, and then taking a problem-solving approach to conflicts, and then kind of diving into challenging conversations for the 3rd course. So it's pretty broad. But it gets participants into conflict a little bit more where, a lot of organizations may not have those specific points of access other than you either don't deal with the things that come up or they go to the grievance level. So these particular workshops focus in on the tools that supervisors or somebody that has a colleague they're in conflict with, or HR managers or ER managers can use to address conflict before it gets to kind of that more escalated point.
That's where you want to be. Perfect. So thank you to my 2 guests, Susan and
Thank you.
Katrina. Thank you very much. And for the rest of you, I encourage you to visit the Scheinman Institute website through Cornell University. There's tons of resources there. This really helps you get your head wrapped around a lot of the issues we talked about here, and in addition to some of the course materials, I think my colleague Connie will be sharing some URLs as well. So I want to thank all of you for coming. Great questions that came up, and thank you too for having a great conversation today.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks everybody. We'll see you next time for the next Human Resources webcast.